Ja, guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Herzlich willkommen hier am Hamburger Institut für Sozialforschung. Ich beginne leider mit einer schlechten Nachricht, die damit zusammenhängt, dass die Abstimmungen in der Bürgerschaft derzeit verzögert werden und deswegen der Senator Broster, der uns immer sehr gewogen ist und Sie deswegen auch herzlich grüßen lässt, leider nicht erscheinen kann, weil vermutlich die Abstimmung erst zu Ende ist, wenn wir mehr oder minder mit der Veranstaltung zu Ende sind. Und das Ganze ist natürlich sehr unglücklich, aber es passiert in der Politik eben manchmal, weil bestimmte Dinge eben kontingent und nicht planbar sind. Also nochmal herzlichen Gruß, auch nochmal ganz bewusst Gruß an Monika Prasad, sodass wir heute auch die Veranstaltung so ein bisschen umkrempeln müssen. Ich würde sagen, ich fange jetzt, was ohnehin gedacht ist, an, sozusagen ein bisschen was zum Landshut-Preis zu erzählen, werde dann die Laudatio halten, danach wird der Vortrag von Monika Prasad kommen und danach gehen wir zum Essen. Gut, vielleicht ganz kurz und ganz wenige Worte zum Siegfried-Landshut-Preis. Der Siegfried-Landshut-Preis wurde ins Leben gerufen vor 5 Jahren und hatte den Sinn und hat noch immer den Sinn, mehr oder minder Konsens auch im Institut zu stiften über bestimmte Debatten, über bestimmte Personen, prominente Personen der Wissenschaft, die für die Wissenschaftlerinnen auch eine Art Vorbild sind. Ja, und wir hatten in der Vergangenheit verschiedene Preisträger, ich nenne jetzt eher zufällig 2 Namen, George Steinmetz beispielsweise oder Marion Fourcade, die sozusagen diese Art von Vorbildfunktion haben und die Wissenschaftlerinnen des Institutes wählen, weil sie mit ihnen in Kontakt kommen wollen, aber weil sie auch ehren wollen, weil sie finden, dass ihr Övre sozusagen für die jungen Nachwuchswissenschaftlerinnen hier am Institut eben auch ein Ansporn ist, auch quasi ein Vorbild ist und sozusagen eines, dem wir eben nacheifern wollen. Ja, das ist der Hintergrund dieses Landshut-Preises. Wir freuen uns ganz besonders auf den heutigen Abend, dass Monika Prasad es geschafft hat, auf komplizierte Weise über Island hierher nach Hamburg zu kommen. Sie wird den Vortrag halten. Wir haben, glaube ich, die Möglichkeit, wird sich spontan ergeben, auch möglicherweise darüber zu diskutieren auch noch. Ich nehme an, die ganze Veranstaltung wird so gegen 9 Uhr zu Ende sein und wir werden dann nach einer gewissen Zeremonie runtergehen zu uns in den Garten. Das Wetter ist ja sehr schön und werden dort essen und trinken. Ich beginne mit der Laudatio auf Monika Prasad, die etwas länger wird, ja, angemessen der Preisträgerin. Eine Forscherin oder einen Forscher für einen von einem Forschungsinstitut zu vergebenen Preis zu identifizieren, ist eine ebenso leichte wie schwierige Angelegenheit. Natürlich muss die mögliche Preisträgerin eine herausragende Wissenschaftlerin sein. Davon gibt es einige. Und insofern ist die alljährliche Übung hier am Hamburger Institut für Sozialforschung eigentlich eine leichte, wenn Sie unsere Wissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftler zusammensetzen, um über Kandidatinnen und Kandidaten zu diskutieren. Freilich haben diese es sich zur Aufgabe gemacht, solche zu suchen, die auch zum Institut passen und die mit dem Namensgeber des Preises, Siegfried Landshut, kompatibel sind. Und hier wird es dann schon schwieriger, weil man natürlich in einem interdisziplinären Forschungsinstitut nicht Preisträger oder Preisträgerinnen haben will, die zwar vielleicht brillant sind, aber nur auf einem sehr engen Spezialgebiet des jeweiligen Faches und nur dort ihre wissenschaftlichen Leistungen vollbracht haben. Und kann, so die sofort sich stellende Frage, der spätere Laudator, in dem Fall ich, und einem solchen benötigt man ja bei einer Preisverleihung, wirklich am Abend der Preisverleihung in plausibler Weise den Konsens zwischen Siegfried Landshut, den Kontext zwischen Siegfried Landshut auf der einen Seite und der Preisträgerin bzw. dem Preisträger auf der anderen herstellen. Nun, die Wissenschaft hier am HIS hat eine extrem gute Wahl getroffen, die mir die Laudatio einfach macht. Denn mit Monika Prasad hat sie eine Preisträgerin gefunden, durch deren Övre sich nicht nur der interdisziplinäre und internationale Vergleich zieht. Monika Prasad hat sich zudem in souveräner Weise in so unterschiedlichen Feldern wie der historischen Soziologie, der Wirtschaftssoziologie, der Fiskalsoziologie, der politischen Soziologie und der soziologischen Theorie bewegt und dort jeweils ganz eigenständige Argumente entwickelt und imponierende Resultate vorgelegt. Ja, mehr noch, sie hat, vermutlich unwissentlich, insbesondere einen Punkt von Siegfried Landshut aufgegriffen, der diesem immer ganz wichtig war. Landshut, dieser von den Nazis ins Exil getriebene deutsch-jüdische Politikwissenschaftler, der in den 50er Jahren, in den frühen 50er Jahren nach Deutschland und an die Universität Hamburg zurückgekehrt war, ist politisch nicht so einfach zu verorten. Er kannte seinen Max Weber ebenso gut wie seinen Karl Marx, war aber mit Sicherheit kein Marxist. Dennoch hat Landshut letzteren, also Marx, aber vor allem aus einem Grund geschätzt und damit mehr oder minder explizit auch Weber kritisiert. Landshut lobte Marx stets dafür, dass er wusste, warum und wofür er politische Ökonomie betrieb. Dies, so seine Einschätzung, sei bei Max Weber dann schon anders gewesen, weil dieser aufgrund der starken Betonung der Objektivitätsproblematik in den Sozialwissenschaften kaum mehr die Frage stellte, warum man überhaupt Sozialwissenschaften betreibe. Eine Antwort darauf, so Landshut, müssen Sozialwissenschaftler und Sozialwissenschaftlerinnen aber haben. Eine Disziplin, auch die Soziologie, braucht Orientierung, muss also folgende Fragen beantworten können. Wozu Soziologie und was ist für dieses Fach wesentlich und was nicht? Nun, Monika Prasad hat insbesondere in den letzten 5 bis 10 Jahren in hochinteressanten Texten darauf die Antwort gegeben, die lautet, die Soziologie ist und sollte sein, vor allem eine problemlösende Disziplin, was für deutsche Ohren zunächst etwas ungewohnt klingen mag, was ich hoffe aber im Laufe meiner Ausführungen näher erläutern zu können. Nur so viel jetzt. Soziologie ist Prasad zufolge nicht in erster Linie Beschreibung, auch nicht Kritik. Hauptaufgabe der Soziologie ist vielmehr die Identifizierung sozialer Probleme und unter Wahrung des Objektivitätsideals. Es geht also nicht um politischen Aktivismus, das Auffinden kausaler Prozesse, um dadurch die Möglichkeit zu eröffnen, Probleme, seien diese nun Ungleichheit, Armut oder Rassismus, zu lösen. Eine Soziologie, so Prasad, die das nicht tut oder nicht einmal versucht, ist eine, die droht zu verarmen bzw. sich selbst ihrer Existenzgrundlagen zu berauben. Aber der Reihe nach. Monika Prasad studierte Englisch und Religious Studies, bevor sie an die University of Chicago ging, um dort schließlich ihren Master in Soziologie und dann im Jahr 2000 ihre von Andrew Abbott und George Steinmetz betreute Dissertation zu schreiben. 2 Soziologen, die nebenbei bemerkt hier am Haus wohl bekannt sind. Der eine Abbott dadurch, dass Texte von ihm in der Hamburger Edition erschienen sind, der andere dadurch, dass er selbst Landshut-Preisträger war und demnächst sein Buch zu den kolonialen Wurzeln der Soziologie auf Deutsch ebenfalls in unserem Verlag veröffentlichen wird, also George Steinmetz. Aus Prasads Dissertation ging dann ihr Buch The Politics of Free Markets hervor, eine vergleichende Studie zu neoliberalen Politikansätzen in Großbritannien, Frankreich, Deutschland und den Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika. In dieser brillanten Studie gelang es Prasad, nicht nur die landläufige Rede vom unaufhaltsamen Siegeszug des Neoliberalismus zu hinterfragen, indem sie demonstrierte, wie unterschiedlich die politischen Prozesse waren, die in den 4 Ländern nach 1945 zu jeweils sehr verschiedenen Ergebnissen in den 1970er, 80er und 90er Jahren führten. Sie zeigte auch, und daran sollte sie in folgenden Aufsätzen und Büchern weiterarbeiten, dass die Treiber des Neoliberalismus durchaus nicht die üblichen Verdächtigen waren. Es waren Vorstellungen hinsichtlich einer auf Wachstum getrimmten Industriepolitik, die auf schon länger bestehende, sehr disparate Staats- und Steuerstrukturen trafen, was dann politische Akteure, Betonung liegt auf politische Akteure, also nicht in erster Linie wirtschaftliche, dazu trieb, in den 1970er Jahren auf eine neoliberale Agenda zu setzen. Dies war ganz dezidiert vor allem in Großbritannien und den USA der Fall, nicht jedoch in Frankreich und Deutschland, und zwar aus dem noch zu erörternden Grund, weil die USA und Großbritannien gegen jede übliche Intuition und Vermutung ein sehr viel progressiveres und damit auf Umverteilung setzendes Steuersystem hatten und gerade dadurch bestimmte Effekte eintreten konnten, denen man in Deutschland und Frankreich entkam. Dazu sogleich mehr. Prasad jedenfalls verdichtete fast zeitgleich mit dem Erscheinen ihres Buches ihre Einsichten nochmals in einem großartigen Aufsatz im American Journal of Sociology, der den witzigen Titel trug Why is France so French? Sie zeigt in diesem Artikel, dass der französische Staat nach 1945 nie das Ziel hatte, soziale Gerechtigkeit herzustellen, setzte er doch sehr viel stärker und in erster Linie auf Industrialisierung. Was es an wohlfahrtsstaatlichen Strukturen gab, das hatte zur Basis das Versicherungsprinzip, von dem vor allem die Mittelschichten profitierten. Gar nicht so anders wie im deutschen Fall ging es also nicht um Umverteilung. Dabei war nun das ganze staatliche System in Frankreich, und dies ist eine Geschichte, die ins 19. Jahrhundert zurückreicht, finanziell auf eher unsichtbare indirekte Steuern aufgebaut. Also auf tendenziell regressiv wirkende Steuern, die, weil oft versteckt, nicht so einfach offen politisiert werden konnten und können. Steuerrevolten waren deshalb in Frankreich vergleichsweise wenig gegeben, was dieses Land von den USA mit den dortigen progressiven direkten Steuern unterschied, wo es insbesondere in Kalifornien, als sich nicht zuletzt aufgrund von Inflation die ökonomischen Rahmenbedingungen vor allem für die Mittelschichten verschlechterten, zu derartigen Revolten kam, weshalb dann auch die Wähler und die Politik in den 1970er Jahren plötzlich ein Ziel finden konnten, die Senkung von Steuern. Die Forderung nach dem schlanken Staat und alle damit einhergehenden neoliberalen Politikvorstellungen waren also keine, die irgendwelche Unternehmerverbände oder Kapitalisten formuliert oder die irgendwelche Intellektuelle sich auf die Fahne geschrieben hätten, sondern solche, die im politischen Prozess, im Wechselspiel zwischen Politikern und ihren Wählerinnen implementiert worden sind. Prasad wurde wohl, so würde ich es deuten, im Verlauf ihrer Untersuchungen zu neoliberalen Politiken immer klarer, dass die Frage von Steuern für Erklärungsansätze in der Politik ganz zentral sind, gleichzeitig aber eine etablierte Fiskalsoziologie kaum existierte und existiert. Es war deshalb, und dies ganz folgerichtig, einer ihrer wichtigsten intellektuellen Schritte nach 2006, dass sie mittlerweile auf eine Professur an der Northwestern University berufen, sich um eine solche kümmerte und dann 2009 einen bahnbrechenden Sammelband herausbrachte mit dem selbsterklärenden Titel The New Fiscal Sociology, in dem in systematischer Weise die politisch-soziologische Bedeutung von Steuern zum Thema wurde, was dann auch Kolleginnen und Kollegen hier am Hamburger Institut für Sozialforschung, wie etwa Lars Döpking, enorm beeinflusst hat. Prasad beließ es aber nicht dabei, die Fiskalsoziologie systematisch und theoretisch zu durchdringen. Vielmehr ging sie nun einem Rätsel nach, auf das sie schon in ihrer Dissertation gestoßen war. Wie kann es sein, dass dieser vermeintlich so liberale und deshalb anscheinend so schwache US-amerikanische Staat ein System progressiver direkter Steuern hatte, wie sie dies ja in ihrer Dissertation hatte feststellen müssen? Was waren die Ursachen hierfür? Das sollte das Thema ihres 2012 erschienenen Buches werden, The Land of Too Much, American Abundance and the Paradox of Poverty, das im Übrigen demnächst in der Hamburger Edition erscheinen wird. Ein Buch, das aus vielen, ich würde sagen viel zu vielen Gründen bemerkenswert ist, als dass ich sie alle hier aufzählen könnte. Der vielleicht für ein deutsches Publikum überraschendste Zug, das überraschendste Merkmal, ist vielleicht folgendes. Prasad zieht zur Erklärung der Tatsache, dass ausgerechnet die USA lange Zeit, nämlich bis in die 1970er Jahre hinein, im Unterschied zu vielen europäischen Ländern ein höchst progressiv wirkendes, direktes Steuersystem hatten, die Geschichte der Landwirtschaft heran. In der deutschen Soziologie, ich bin überzeugt davon, die kaum je die Agrargeschichte wahrgenommen hat, wäre man vermutlich auf eine solche Idee nicht gekommen. Aber Prasad tut nun genau diesen Schritt und zeigt, wie die US-amerikanische Agrarökonomie im letzten Drittel des 19. Jahrhunderts zur produktivsten der Welt wurde, mit daraus folgenden enormen Exportchancen, die sie auch zu nutzen versuchte. Die US-Farmer begannen mit Blick auf verschiedenste landwirtschaftliche Produkte den Weltmarkt zu dominieren, was aber vor allem in Europa schnell dazu führte, dass man schon Anfang des 20. Jahrhunderts mittels Zollerhöhungen protektionistische Maßnahmen ergriff, um die heimische nationale Landwirtschaft vor der US-Konkurrenz zu schützen. In den USA selbst, also dort selbst, führte die wachsende Produktivität der Landwirtschaft gleichzeitig zu einem ruinösen Preiswettbewerb, der viele Farmer an den Rand des Ruins brachte, weil unter den Bedingungen des Goldstandards die Preise für ihre Produkte immer weiter fielen. Dadurch amortisierten sich ihre früher auf der Basis von Krediten getätigten Investitionen nicht mehr, geschweige denn, dass sie neu investieren konnten. Die Farmer verschuldeten sich also, dies vor allem im Ersten Weltkrieg und dann in den 1930er Jahren, als mit der großen Depression eine weitere Phase des Preisverfalls und somit der farmwirtschaftlichen Verschuldung eingeläutet wurde. Und in dieser Situation kam es dann zu einer Art politischen Übereinkunft zwischen Farmern und Arbeitern, die sich gegen indirekte Verbrauchssteuern aussprachen, was ihnen aus unterschiedlichen Gründen finanziell geschadet hätte, und für die Einführung von progressiv wirkenden direkten Steuern, um die Steuerlast nach oben, also hier und hin zu den wohlhabenden Schichten zu verschieben, dorthin also, wo sich durch die Industrialisierung in den USA der meiste Reichtum angesammelt hat. Politisch konnten sie bzw. die regierende Demokratische Partei diesen New Deal der 1930er Jahre dann auch umsetzen. Gleichzeitig wurde staatlicherseits die ökonomische Krise der großen Depression, im Unterschied etwa zu Deutschland, nicht durch Sparen bekämpft, sondern durch die Ausweitung des Konsums. Der US-amerikanische Staat ermöglichte es zur Überwindung der ökonomischen Krise sowohl den Farmern als auch den Mittelschichten günstige Kredite für agrarische Investitionen und Häuserkäufe aufzunehmen, was einen frühen Schritt in die Finanzialisierung der US-amerikanischen Wirtschaft bedeutete. Lange vor den 1970er Jahren, wo dies ja auch in erster Linie diskutiert worden ist. Die Nebenfolge all dieser politischen Prozesse in den USA, so Prasad, war nun aber paradoxerweise, dass nach 1945 in einem Land wie den USA, das einen vergleichsweise starken, weil auf direkten progressiven Steuern basierenden Staatsapparat hatte, gleichzeitig aber Strukturen geschaffen wurden, die gerade die Armutsbekämpfung enorm schwierig machten, die also dazu führten, dass die Vereinigten Staaten innerhalb der OECD-Welt mit den größten Armutsproblemen kämpfen, was noch weiter verschärft wurde dadurch, als es in den 1970er Jahren dazu kam, dass diese direkten Steuern, Stichwort Steuerrebellion, irgendwann dann auch massiv zurückgefahren wurden. Eine auf Konsumausweitung basierende politische Ökonomie, in der man genau deshalb auch glaubte, wenig für den Aufbau wohlfahrtsstaatlicher Strukturen tun zu müssen, manövrierte sich in eine Situation, in der Armut und deren Bekämpfung kaum mehr zum Thema wurde. Prasad sollte diese Materie auch später noch beschäftigen, sodass sie 2018 ein weiteres Buch mit dem Titel Starving the Beast, Ronald Reagan and the Tax Cut Revolution veröffentlichte. Wiederum ein enorm innovatives Werk mit Bezug auf die Frage, wer die treibenden Kräfte hinter dieser die US-amerikanische Politik als ganzer prägender politischen Wende war. Ich habe nicht die Zeit, hierauf näher einzugehen und möchte stattdessen zum Schluss ein eher theoretisches Projekt ansprechen, dem sich Prasad in den letzten 5 bis 10 Jahren gewidmet hat und das ich ganz zu Beginn meiner Laudatio schon angerissen habe. das Projekt einer problemlösenden Soziologie. Prasad hat ihre diesbezügliche Position in mehreren Aufsätzen Ende der 2010er Jahre vorbereitet, bevor 2021 Problem Solving Sociology erschien. Ein Buch, das sich zwar an Grad Students richtet, aber meines Erachtens irgendwie auch falsch betitelt ist, weil es eigentlich auch ein größeres Fachpublikum adressiert und auch theorieorientierte Leute sozusagen massiv ansprechen sollte. Was ist problemlösende Soziologie? Nun, es ist sicherlich keine angewandte Forschung, wie man es vielleicht aufgrund der Namensgebung vermuten könnte. Es ist auch keine Auftragsforschung. Die Forscherinnen und Forscher, darauf beharrt Prasad, haben ihre Probleme immer selbst zu definieren. Sie sind nicht Gehilfen der Politik oder anderer offizieller oder semi-offizieller institutioneller Kontexte. Prasad setzt sich aber auch von einer Public Sociology à la Michael Borroway ab, der allzu leicht professionelle Standards zugunsten einer Stellungnahme für die Anliegen politischer Aktivisten preisgeben will. Demgegenüber beharrt Prasad auf eben diesen professionellen Kriterien, machte sich doch stark für die Objektivitätsposition in den Sozialwissenschaften eines Max Weber. Sozialwissenschaften haben objektiv zu sein. So muss es, und dies betont, wie ich finde, sehr plausibel, Monica Prasad, beispielsweise westlichen Wissenschaftlerinnen, ohne dem Ethnozentrismusvorwurf zu verfallen, immer auch möglich sein, Strukturen in der dritten Welt zu untersuchen und gegebenenfalls kritisch zu beleuchten, solange die Methoden und Ergebnisse von allen nachvollzogen werden können. Und umgekehrt gilt natürlich dasselbe. Normative Verbote in dieser Hinsicht lehnt Prasad ab. Vielmehr ist es ihr Anliegen, normative Fragen in analytische zu verwandeln. Wiederum durchaus in großer Nähe zu Max Weber. Aber gleichzeitig verdankt sie dem frühen amerikanischen Pragmatismus um John Dewey und William James, auch den Autoren der sogenannten Chicago School of Sociology, sehr viel mehr, als man das von einer klassischen Weberianerin erwarten würde. Und diesbezüglich ist Prasad auch nicht eine solche. Sie ist keine Weberianerin, würde ich sagen. Sie macht vielmehr klar, dass es den Pragmatisten und den Soziologinnen in Chicago zur Wende vom 19. ins 20. Jahrhundert immer darum ging, Probleme zu lösen. Und genau dies ist auch ihr Programm, weshalb sie, und das ist das Aufregende ihrer Position, durchaus kritisch Soziologinnen und Soziologen charakterisiert, die nur beschreiben wollen, ohne zu verallgemeinern, wodurch sie sich Lösungswegen verweigern, weshalb sie Soziologinnen und Soziologen kritisiert, die nur kritisieren, anstatt kausale Prozesse ausfindig zu machen, deren Kenntnis ja erst Interventionen und damit Lösungen ermöglichen. Das hört sich zunächst eher abstrakt an, und doch sind Prasads diesbezügliche Aussagen, wie ich finde, enorm aufschlussreich und praktisch. Um nur einen Aspekt zu nennen, ich glaube, mit guten Gründen rät Prasad dringend dazu, allmählich von einer Soziologie Abstand zu nehmen, die nur auf die Opfer, sie sagt, die Victims von Ungerechtigkeit, Ungleichheit, Umweltschäden etc. blickt. So normativ geboten erscheint, sich gerade den Armen, den Migrantinnen, den Bedrängten, den Geschädigten zu nähern, sie zu verstehen, ihnen beiseite zu stehen. Und wie viele Soziologinnen und Soziologen haben nicht genau aus diesem Anliegen heraus ihren Weg in die Soziologie gefunden, so wenig fruchtbar es erscheint, genau dies zu tun, so wenig fruchtbar erscheint ihr, dies genau zu tun. Denn Prasad sagt, wer Probleme lösen will, muss etwas über die Villains sagen, also die Schurken. Die sind manchmal Einzelpersonen, manchmal und vielleicht sogar öfters natürlich auch institutionelle Arrangements, die genau diese Armut, diese Ungerechtigkeit, diese Diskriminierung herbeiführten und oder stabilisieren. Das Studium der Villains, der Schurken, so Prasad, lehrt uns meist sehr viel mehr über die Entstehung von Armut, von Diskriminierung, von Schädigung, als nur der Blick auf die Opfer. Die Soziologie muss mit Hilfe dieses Blickwinkels aktiv werden, aktiv, nicht aktivistisch. Und meine Vermutung ist, dass, wie schon angemerkt, der Politikwissenschaftler Siegfried Landshut eine solche von Monica Prasad vertretene Soziologie durchaus attraktiv, mindestens aber hochinteressant gefunden hätte. Und auch deswegen ist die nun seit einigen Monaten an der Johns Hopkins University lehrende und forschende Monica Prasad genau die richtige Person, die unsere Wissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftler hier am Hamburger Institut für Sozialforschung für den Siegfried-Landshut-Preis 2023 ausgesucht haben. Monica Prasad, ich gratuliere Ihnen ganz herzlich zum Preis. Vielleicht ganz kurz noch eine Erörterung. Die Laudatio, auch das Grußwort, wurden auf Deutsch gehalten, weil Monica Prasad ausgezeichnet Deutsch spricht und versteht. Sie hält den Vortrag aber auf Englisch und wir werden dann sehen, wenn es Fragen gibt, ob die auf Deutsch gehalten werden, und das entscheiden einfach Sie. Ja, also es war jetzt keine Unhöflichkeit, dass ich und Herr Broster sozusagen auf Deutsch redeten oder reden wollten, sondern Monica Prasad versteht ausgezeichnet Deutsch und spricht auch ausgezeichnet Deutsch. Nochmal, vielen Dank.
Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank, Wolfgang. Das ist wirklich eine Ehre, hier eingeladen zu werden und diesen Preis zu bekommen. Und es ist wirklich eine besondere Ehre, dass Sie, Wolfgang, haben meine Arbeit so genau durchgelesen. 20 Jahre von Bücher und Artikel und sowas. Und diese Worte habe ich zum ersten Mal gehört. Schurkenwillen? Okay, das war mir nicht bekannt, danke. Es ist auch eine Ehre, dass Sie alle hier sind. Ich weiß, dass es sehr wichtig Europameisterschaftsspiel heute gibt. Also das ist das größte Ehre, dass Sie das verpassen, um meinen Vortrag zu hören. Also den Vortrag werde ich auf Englisch halten, aber danach können wir vielleicht auf Deutsch diskutieren. Okay, so if you go to this QR code, or if you went to this QR code, you will see this page. It's called How Rich Am I? You put in your income here, and it tells you how rich you are compared to the rest of the world. So in Hamburg, the median household income is 55,000 euros. For a family of 2 adults and 2 kids. If that's how much you make, you're in the top 11% of the world. In Germany, in general, the poverty line is 16,224 euros. If that's how much you make, you're in the top 19.3% of the world. So I had the sense a few years ago that what I had been doing in all of this research that Wolfgang so generously talked to you about is that I had been talking about trying to redistribute from the top 1% to the top 19% or the top 20%, and that I was ignoring this enormous 80% of the world. So in this talk and in some of my research now, that's what I'm doing. I'm looking more at the forgotten 80% of the world. And to do that, I'm going to tell you today about one of my projects, which is on Somaliland. If we want to study poverty around the world, if we want to improve the lives of people around the world, one lesson we have learned over the last several decades is that you have to build capable states. So in the 1980s and the 1990s, we went through a massive experiment in reducing the size of the state. Neoliberalism, people call it. Privatization, deregulation, etc. And one of the things we learned is that the market is not enough. If you really want to address these issues, even institutions like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund now agree that you need effective state institutions. So the topic of governance and effective institutions has become prominent in the development world. So I'm interested in Somaliland because it's a case of successful state building. So Somalia, this country here, is practically a synonym for state failure. If you look at any of these indices of the Fragile Fund Index, the Fragile State Index, the Fund for Peace Index, Somalia is generally number 1 or number 2 in the most fragile states. It's marked by religious extremism, piracy, just absence of effective states. However, Somaliland, this area in the northwest of Somalia, is a breakaway region of Somalia. 33 years ago, it claimed independence. It's not recognized as a state by the international community, but it's developed a very workable and democratic state that now has several decades of experience conducting elections that have been considered free and fair by outside observers. I'll give you just a few glimpses of that. So on the left column here is Somalia, excluding Somaliland, and the right is Somaliland. So if you look at scores of democracy, this is a Freedom House democracy scales on a scale of 0 to 100. Somalia is not democratic at all. It literally gets a 7. Somaliland is doing much better. It gets a 49. Similarly, the Variety of Democracy score. What's really striking to me is this conflict deaths number. So the population of Somaliland is about 6 million, about 9 to 10 million in Somalia. In Somalia, it's almost 40,000 conflict deaths. In Somaliland, it's about a 20th of that. And this is actually understating the difference because a lot of those deaths in Somaliland happened about 20 years ago. So Somaliland has somehow managed to accomplish this monopoly of violence that we associate with the state as state building. So I use it to develop new theories of state building, which we need because in the modern world, state building does not look like the process through which states were built in the Western world. So in the Western world, war, of course, played a big role in state building, as we all know from Charles Tilly. That is no longer the case. The international system of states does not allow one state to declare war on and take over another. Usually doesn't allow it. Tries very hard to not allow it. So in the absence of war, we need a different kind of theory. Several scholars have pointed out that nowadays, non-state authorities play a large role in the state. By non-state authorities, I'm talking about tribal groups, clans, kinship groups, religious groups, caste groups. And these cannot be sidelined through war, as was the case for Western states. So in sociology, Julia Adams, Munira Sharad, Elizabeth Clemens have talked about this kind of thing. In the law and society literature, I know there's a legal scholars here. In the law and society literature, they talk about parallel legal systems, for example. In international relations, they call it hybrid governance. So the formal state working in tandem with these non-state sources of authority. And so all this work is pointing to the same thing, that the state can be composed of actors who draw their authority from ways that Max Weber thought the state had left behind. So in Somaliland, it's clan-based groups that are this kind of hybrid authority. A clan is people who are related through a father's line, the patrilineage. So all Somalis learn their patrilineage as children. They learn their father's father name. They can all tell you how this tree goes. There are several major clan groupings and sub-clan and sub-sub-clan groupings. And the traditional pattern of authority is to designate clan elders as the authority figures. The clans are intermarried, which means that this is biologically one population that separates itself artificially in this way. And that leads to this kind of uneasy proximity of the clans, which you can see in Somali folklore. So these are some poems and lullabies and things from Somaliland. This one says, "We were matrilineal kin, yet every dwelling we build, you smash the next morning. We are being denied peace. As to our mutual family links, they are the ones who are disowning them. It is your turn to ignore them and prepare for all-out war. In the very first task, each of us must slay his own maternal uncle." So the clans live in this kind of uneasy proximity. They're intermarried, but they fight over things like grazing rights, camels, things like that. This is a lullaby. "Hunger is not my child, a game of wordplay. The Gidi Hamo of the Golwarabe, may Allah smash them, have driven our camels to the coast." This one, "You were used to protruding-mouthed camels and to women deprived of cream to brighten their faces, and also unseasoned dry cereals that cause gnawing pain in the stomach. Thus misery is your lot. But if you knew the laughing Harawo countryside with heifers calving and the resulting ghee in abundance, you would have been enticed to come quickly. And here is my move in the game of shocks." So clans are interacting with each other in this kind of sometimes in alliance, sometimes in competition. And one of the main patterns of authority is that when there is a fight between clans, there is this system. The clan elders of the various clans will sit under an acacia tree, and they will try to solve the problem in that way. And the Somaliland state basically emerged out of this pattern of problem solving. During Somaliland's fight for independence, the elders were instrumental in mobilizing the populace to support the fighters and bringing resources such as food and clothing for the fighters, etc. So as a result, the clan elders received a role in governance, in government in Somaliland. In Somalia, this is not possible because the system of clan elders was destroyed by the colonizers. So this is the basic difference between Somaliland and Somalia. So this is the hybrid governance. Somaliland is successful as a state because it has this pattern of hybrid governance. Now, there has been a lot written about hybrid governance, and there's a question of whether or not it's a good thing. So I showed you that Somaliland is able to, have all of these positive outcomes compared to Somalia. So in the beginning, when people started talking about hybrid governance, there was a sense that this is something that we should take seriously. This is something important. So here are some quotes from scholars arguing that when traditional leaders are more legitimate than a government, it is an illusion to think that it's possible to build a functioning state without close cooperation of the traditional leaders. Instead of assuming that the complete adoption of Western state models is the most appropriate avenue, we should focus more attention on models of governance that draw on the strengths of social order and resilience embedded in community life. And then in one specific case in Afghanistan, these two scholars are saying, the advocacy of abolitionist Afghan feminist voices had been better understood in the West and has attracted more Western donor funds than the reformist feminist voices. Some of these voices operate as expensively funded civil society NGOs, which ironically call for the abolition of the oldest and self-sustained civil society organ in Afghanistan, jirgas or shuras, which are non-state dispute resolution mechanism. So these scholars want to draw our attention to traditional mechanisms of authority, want us to appreciate them, and are suggesting that these are even more legitimate than state sources, than Western sorts of state sources of authority. Very soon, however, a more critical perspective emerged among scholars. So these are a set of scholars arguing, to what extent does the celebration of local order simply make a virtue of deprivation, rather than contributing to the improvement of governance and public accountability? And a major drawback of many traditional authorities and customary forms of dispute resolution is that they tend to be dominated by local elites. They often reinforce inequalities in land rights and livelihoods, and they frequently discriminate on the basis of gender and minority status. And again, on Afghanistan, expert knowledge steeped in Orientalist frames was used in attempts to override political contestation about the currency of informal justice mechanisms. Western academic work, which purported to provide Afghan-led solutions, was thus doing the exact opposite, foreclosing the possibility of national debate in what were essentially political questions about competing visions of social orders and who was authorized to dispense justice. So each side is calling the other Western and Orientalist, right? So either it's Orientalist to ignore local forms of authority, or it's Orientalist to promote them and say that these countries should only have this different kind of authority, right? So there is the celebratory perspective, there is this critical perspective. And so these are pretty well established. The question that I ask in this talk is, can hybrid structures evolve to become more inclusive? So there are these clear problems: gender discrimination, discrimination against minorities, lack of accountability. And so I want to ask, can you take a hybrid structure and can it evolve in the direction of a Weberian state? And so that's the question that I'm studying in the case of Somaliland. The work that I'm going to talk about is drawn from the empirical work is interviews and archival research that I conducted in Hargeisa, the capital city of Somaliland. So I want to begin with a framework that Mara Loveman puts forth of hybrid structures. She suggests there are 3 kinds of hybrid structures, actually 4, but the 4th doesn't apply for various reasons. One is, she says that you can have innovation, which is just the invention of new practices that don't have parallels in the traditional authority system. In that case, the state is ignoring the local authorities. And so in my work, I consider elections an example of this kind of innovation, something that the local authority doesn't do. A second is imitation, which she says creating parallel state agencies to undertake administrative activities already practiced in a closely related form by local secular or religious authorities. So this one I call the state is tolerating the local authority structure. And then finally, she talks about co-optation, in which the state is incorporating traditional administrative practices and practitioners into the state apparatus. In this one, the state is embracing the local authority structure. For this, I'm studying, in particular in Somaliland, the Gurti. It's the upper house of parliament. It's composed of traditional clan elders. All right, so I'm going to talk about these 3 kinds of hybrid structure and how they have evolved in Somaliland. All right, so first, consider the institution of elections in Somaliland, an example of Loveman's innovation. Now, Somaliland's greatest success has been in repeatedly showing that it can hold free and fair elections and transfer power peacefully, which is very rare in this part of Africa. So it started with local council elections in 2002, and since it has held both parliamentary and presidential elections. Particularly notable was the presidential election of 2003, which produced a winning margin of 80 votes. Now, if you had an 80-vote margin in Germany or in the U.S., it would be civil war. But they managed to conclude this peacefully. The losing candidate was a former chair of the movement that had won the country's independence. The winning candidate was from a non-majority clan, and he had been a military officer for the enemy, Somalia. Despite this was all concluded peacefully. Despite that, this incredible accomplishment, despite that, voting has been the site of the resurgence of clans, because fighting elections takes resources, and to raise resources, candidates fall back on their clan ties, which are particularly important given the surrounding context of poverty. Elections are very expensive. Candidates turn to the one source of financial support they know they can count on, their extended family or their subclan. Winning candidates are then beholden to their clan supporters, and parties take on clan inflections as supporters are mobilized along clan lines. So the contest for electoral democracy itself entrenches and exaggerates lines of difference. Old patterns of affiliation are repurposed to respond to other challenges too, such as capital accumulation for purposes of business development. So this is the Klan voting in the 2005 election. It's very hard to get data on a lot of these things, so this is really the only one that I could find for the various elections that have happened. But you can see there's a sort of Klan inflection here, which, you know, it's not too bad. You get social cleavages in every country, right? But a particular consequence of this pattern of Klan inflection of the elections is that women are sidelined from politics. Because the clans are intermarried, women's clan loyalties are seen with suspicion because the subclan of a woman's father is different from the subclan of her husband, as they see it. So the political parties believe that they can't nominate a woman because they don't really know which clan she is going to side with. So women can't count on getting support from subclans. Thus, they're reluctant. Female candidates have a very difficult time in this structure. So this is one of the ways in which this traditional structure marginalizes women. In fact, even women's rights groups who are struggling to change the system, if they want to mobilize resources, they also have to turn to their clans. Clan is simply how you raise resources. Here's a women's rights activist saying women's rights groups become part of the system. They work along the clan lines. They mobilize these resources along clan lines, mobilize groups along clan lines. You might have some other beliefs, but you can't escape it at the end. So this first kind of institution, elections, ends up in some ways reinforcing, exaggerating clan lines. All right, a second example is the hybrid system of justice. This is an example of Loveman's imitation. Somaliland has three different legal systems. There's the state system, there's the customary system, and there's the religious system, Sharia. More than 3/4 of cases are resolved through the customary system. It's called HERE, and it basically functions through a sub-clan group. It's called the Dia paying group, paying compensation for crimes. So, you know, if somebody from your clan murders somebody from another clan, you will pay that other clan 50 camels or 100 camels, and everybody in the group contributes to that payment. So this is how it's supposed to be a form of social control, because you know that if someone from your clan is going to murder or is going to rape, you're going to have to pay the camels. And so you will try to keep them from doing such things, right? So the customary system's focus is on community reconciliation. And this often overrides individual rights, particularly for women. So the traditional compromise solution for the crime of rape is for the rapist to marry the victim. In this system, rape is seen as a community problem because it threatens instability between subclans. Moreover, from this point of view, the main problem that rape poses is that the victim is unable to find a husband and lead a quote-unquote normal life. Forcing the rapist to marry the victim solves both problems, whatever the views of the victim may be. Customary law is popular not only because it accords with local cultural values, but also because it's much quicker and less expensive. So lack of tax revenue to finance formal courts, lack of money to build a legal system, to train lawyers, all of this makes the formal legal system all but inaccessible to the population. Courts require travel. They may require bribing formal state actors, forcing people to take out loans or to sell assets. Meanwhile, the customary system is local, it's convenient, it doesn't require any fees. Indeed, rather than needing to pay anything, the victim's family often receives a monetary settlement. So in these cases, in these forms of, when the state merely tolerates the local system or ignores it, there is no evolution towards a Weberian state. In these two examples, non-state groups are durable because they accomplish tasks that the state itself cannot accomplish, at least at low levels of economic development and initial levels of state development. So clan and subclan groups help candidates mobilize resources. Clan-based justice systems offer access to justice. these dynamics marginalize women and minorities. So when the state ignores or merely tolerates these forms of authority, these dynamics hollow out state functions and institutions. But now I want to talk about this third possibility, when the state embraces and incorporates non-state actors. So a key feature of Somaliland's hybrid system is that clan elders are incorporated formally into the state in the upper house of the legislature, the Gurti, or the House of Elders. The Gurti is actually a very new innovation. And one thing I was always a little confused by, the Gurti was introduced during the independence fight. One thing I was confused by is that the independence fight was composed of diaspora intellectuals and elites who had studied in the West, who were very, very critical of the whole idea of clan. But then they institute this very traditional structure into the heart of the Constitution. So I got the chance to speak to one of the key figures in the fight, and I asked him about this. So I asked him, you said the discussions in the Somali national movement, everyone was frustrated by clanism, but then the result of the Hargeisa conference is in some sense to institute clans at the heart of the government through the House of Elders to try to protect this culture. So how do you see that tension between trying to protect the culture, which is a culture of clans, versus trying to get out of? And he says, that was when we were discussing how, and the result of the discussion was the Gurti. Because before, no Gurti existed. The Gurti was born because of trying to get a solution to clan. You understand me? So I said the problem was instability. He said, the resources, economic resources, were very, very short. You become the president, and everyone thinks that the $1,000 you got, you give to your clan. So the other one becomes, I don't get any share, the people are all poor, no job. So they come 10-person working in that minister for that clan, my clan only one. How can I accept you? Understand everything goes. So this problem is this one. Basically what he is arguing is that because of clan infighting, all the resources and personnel of the modern state are seen through the prism of clan. So if one person gets a state job, say as Minister of the Interior, it's seen as their clan getting that job. And there is a question of whether the other clans will accept that. So the role of the Gurti is to reassure the members of the other clans that this is okay, this is fair. The other clans will also get representation eventually in the aggregate and in the long term, and that they are still part of government through the Gurti. So because of this system, supporters of the system argue that this contributes to policymakers' willingness to relinquish power, rather than, as in other cases in Africa, trying to cling to it. They feel that through the Gurti, they still have a stake in the system. So paradoxically, this is the paradox of my title, bringing clan elders into the state helps the state to function, and also it weakens traditional practices for two basic reasons. So first, by incorporating non-state groups, by bringing non-state groups into the state is able to mobilize greater resources and legitimacy, which it can then use to create structures and practices that weaken traditional patterns of affiliation. So I said that one dynamic of these non-state sources of authority is that they tend to marginalize women. However, if you examine what's happening with education in Somaliland, women are getting educated and are learning to read. So this first column here is Somalia. So there's not a lot of survey data on Somaliland, so this is just what we have. This is just the reliable data that we have. It's very sporadic. It's on the most recent one is only 2011. Nevertheless, I think you can see some patterns here. So the first column is Somalia in 2006. Something like 12% of primary school-age children are in school, 12% of girls, and about 19% of women are literate. Puntland is a part of Somalia in the northeast. This is a little better governed than the rest of Somalia, and so the numbers are a little bit higher. But look at what's happened in the last three columns, 1996, 2006, and 2011 in Somaliland. So the percent of primary school-age children has gone from 17 to 45 to 51, including girls, which has gone from 38% in 2006 to 47% in 2011. And the percentage of women aged 15 to 24 who are literate has gone from 35% to 44%. So this structure, this very traditional structure, has led to this possibility, the possibility of women getting educated. This is because in the context of peace in Somaliland, education has flourished. The reason for this is that diaspora actors funded the revival of the education sector after it was destroyed during the war, and diaspora Somalis and Somalilanders insisted on education of girls and women. Indeed, it was often women who were doing the work as heads of philanthropic organizations. However, they could only have this effect because of the context of peace. Philanthropic organizations were also important in Somalia, and the role of diasporas and women leaders in diaspora are also similar in Somalia, but they haven't had similar results. Indeed, in the absence of peace in Somalia, diaspora funds intended for humanitarian development often did more harm than good, as they were sometimes diverted to other purposes and captured by warlords and militias, and could even aggravate conflict. Similarly, we don't have a lot of surveys of opinion, so we can't really see how opinions are changing, but there are two attitudinal issues that are addressed in these surveys that I'm showing you: support for female genital mutilation and acceptance of domestic violence. As this slide shows, there is lower support for female genital mutilation in Somaliland and in Puntland or Somalia, as well as lower and declining support for husbands beating wives. Although we don't have the kinds of data that would lead to a confident causal conclusion, in other countries, education has been shown to move attitudes in a less traditional direction, particularly when education is not widespread. So the comparison with Somalia suggests that while the proximate causal factor in the rise of women's and girls' education is the diaspora and the beliefs of diaspora women, these beliefs could only have causal influence in a particular context of peace and an increasingly effective state. By partnering with clan groups, the state has been able to establish peace, which allows the accomplishment of tasks such as overseeing education, including for women and girls, and this seems to be leading to the decline of traditional beliefs. The state has borrowed the legitimacy of traditional clan groups to create conditions that weaken the hold of tradition. So that's the first mechanism that I'm talking about. By bringing clan groups into the state, even though they're traditional, even though they are patriarchal, you create this context that actually can lead to changes in opinions in a less traditional direction. The second mechanism is that entering the messy world of formal politics taints the legitimacy of non-state groups. So the Gurti is unpopular today. This is one of my interviewees saying the strong, talented leadership in the Gurti is gone because they died. It's changed by their sons. Every man that dies, his son comes. It becomes inherited. This place, this chair, was his father's chair. No one else could take it. Everyone respects what his father did. It's respect. He's not able to fulfill the aims and the roles that his father can do. It's a third generation for the chair. 80% are new faces. This guy is actually going to be in the Gurti. He's selected to be in the Gurti, and he's still saying that the Gurti is problematic for all of these reasons. So there are a few reasons why the Gurti has become unpopular. So first, as my interviewee was saying, the Gurti has adopted this dynastic process of selection. This was done to avoid politicizing the selection of seats. Many clans are doing this dynastic process, but it's extremely unpopular among Somalilanders. A second reason is that the Gurti it's a formal actor in politics, and therefore it has the responsibility to take certain political decisions. For example, whether elections will be delayed. And it bears the blame when these decisions end up proving unpopular. And then there's a third reason, is that as a formal actor in politics, the Gurti is positioned in opposition to other political actors. I'll just very briefly tell you about a really important episode that happened between 1993 and 1997. In 1993, the Gurti was allowed to select the president. In 1997, it no longer was allowed to select the president. I go through this in detail in the paper, but basically what I end up arguing is that This was because the president in 1997 was able to get rid of this mechanism because the Gurti was, as a collective composed of many clans, opposed to the president. That is, the president had a reason to fear the Gurti because it could have removed him. So as the Gurti had gotten rid of the prior president, so it could have decided to get rid of this president. He then found it in his political self-interest to promote the alternative of democratic elections for the president, especially because he thought he would win them, as he did. So in other words, in making the Gurti a formal political actor, the Somaliland state brought it into formal politics and arrayed it against a more powerful political actor. For this reason, it was demoted. It lost this piece of power. And the state moved in the direction of more formal and more accountable mechanisms of power and the subordination of non-state actors. So in short, for these three reasons, becoming part of the formal state has been a challenge for the Gurti in trying to avoid the politicization that democracy brings. It has stumbled into a highly unpopular dynastic mode of succession. It has been constituted as an actor in formal politics and therefore takes blame for unpopular decisions, and it experiences opposition from other and stronger political actors. So that's what I mean by the paradox of incorporation. And just briefly to see if this way of looking at the world is helpful in explaining other cases, I will just very, very briefly discuss the case of Afghanistan. So I think if you start to examine what went wrong with the American occupation of Afghanistan, the attempt to build a state there, if you look at it through this lens of trying to work with non-state actors, it becomes very clear that the problem was that the U.S. didn't really have a clear line on how to work with non-state actors. They vacillated between, on the one hand, trying to work with patrimonial leaders in order to borrow their legitimacy, and on the other hand, rejecting as corrupt the networks of patronage that generated their power. So in the very beginning, in order to compete with the legitimacy of the Taliban, the U.S. worked with well-established patronage networks. The most important of these was the patronage network Hamid Karzai had used to launch an uprising against the Taliban. When Karzai became president, maintaining this network in order to maintain the loyalty of his subordinates was one of his key concerns. The American occupation didn't challenge the logic of patronage. In fact, Donald Rumsfeld thought Karzai should develop his power based on patronage in the model of Chicago's Richard J. Daley. So the foreign forces incorporated non-state actors into the state by endowing particular local leaders with resources. These patronage networks continued to operate as they had always done, working on behalf of their kinship groups. And just as voting reinforces clan ties in Somaliland, Karzai's patronage network committed widespread fraud on Karzai's behalf in the election of 2009. So on the one hand, one branch of the American government was working with these patronage networks. On the other hand, another branch was developing an anti-corruption effort. But this effort had very frustrating results. For example, in 2005, the governor of Helmand province was removed when 9 tons of opium were found in his offices. But after his removal, drug trafficking skyrocketed, and some of his followers joined the Taliban. For reasons like that, in 2010, the Obama administration deprioritized the anti-corruption effort. So what one branch of the government had done in painstaking ways was thrown out suddenly by another. But in 2010, 2/3 of poll respondents in Afghanistan believed the government was not doing enough to control corruption, and this led to a strengthening of the legitimacy of the brutal but incorruptible Taliban. So if you are one of the American occupiers, you are pretty frustrated because it seems that all roads lead to the Taliban. If you crack down on corruption, as in the one case, disillusioned members of that patronage network turn to the Taliban. If you do not crack down on corruption, as in the electoral fraud of 2009, disillusioned members of other patronage networks turn to the Taliban. So one reason for the failure of the state-building effort was that American and allied forces could not tame this problematic. But if you look at these issues through the lens of the Somaliland case, we can see that the problem was not non-state actors and patronage networks per se, but rather how they were incorporated in the state structure. So the sequence that we see in Somaliland is that the formal state borrows the legitimacy of non-state actors and then sidelines the non-state actors. In Afghanistan, the key state-building mistake was that state and non-state actors were not structured in opposition. Instead of non-state actors placed in a structure such as the Gurti and the president placed in opposition to them, in Afghanistan, the formal state, personified in the figure of Karzai, was identified with and was the same entity as the non-state actors, his patronage network. This elevated one patronage network in one tribe above others. This rendered the government unpopular with other sectors of society, but attempting to suppress the corruption, i.e. the patronage, of this patronage network, angered the followers of that network, who were also influential. Somaliland's secret, on the other hand, has been to decouple state and non-state logics by installing them in separate parts of the state, thus reassuring followers of different clans that the state represents them, while subordinating the logic of clan to the logic of the formal state. So, in conclusion, I've argued that if we want to address global poverty, we have to build states. If we want to build states, we have to attend to the incremental evolution of the relationship between state and non-state actors. And I've argued that incorporating non-state actors into the state can undermine them, but we need a lot more research on the effects of different modes of incorporation into the state. So, thank you very much.
Wollen wir Fragen jetzt gleich nehmen? Fragen, Kommentare, Kritiken. Wer möchte beginnen?
Oder über problemlose Soziologie oder was auch immer.
Vielleicht bleiben wir erstmal beim Vortrag. Fragen. Stefan Maltan.
About the role of armed force in this, because in many cases family clans also are kind of armed groups in a way. They have control over the potential to mobilize armed men for fighting. What was the case in Somaliland? Was there kind of a push towards disarmament? How did the new state structure deal with the armed potential of the clans, if you want?
So after the Civil War, everybody had guns. There was a very painstaking demobilization effort in which the clan elders played a major role. If anybody is interested in exploring this particular issue, there is a fascinating archive, including video evidence in Hargeisa that I stumbled across, but I don't have time to do anything about. So if anyone wants to write about that, there is that. But yeah, so the clan elders were instrumental in demobilization as well.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk and this very convincing argument. I'm just wanted to ask this clan structure in Somaliland. So they were divided into sub-clans, and was there certain power shifts between these sub-clans within the clans, or is this more of a functional organization between them?
So one line that I have read in the old anthropologies about the old ethnographies about Somaliland is my brother and myself against my cousin, my cousin against my clan group against the rest of the world. So the idea is that there is this sort of multi-level structure. And who you are against isn't actually stable. So you can be in alliance with a different subclan or against that subclan, depending on what the issue is. And in fact, here, which is the customary system, it's this incredibly complicated system of so the way that clans deal with each other has to do with how they have dealt with each other in the past. So like a murder of one clan murdering somebody from another clan is punished differently depending on which subclan it is. So each of the clans has different relationships. So sorry, remind me what exactly you were asking. I got off onto this clan thing, but can you say your question again?
It was basically answered. So I just was wondering whether these power relations between subclans change, and I understand now that they're not like in a hierarchical structure, but have really like individual relationships to other subclans that are really complex, but can change over time. But it's not like that they're like fighting to get higher in the hierarchy of the
Exactly. Yeah, no, the hierarchy is fixed. Yeah, so how clans relate change, and it's completely complicated because, some clans are bigger than others, some have more generations than others, so yeah, but some clans are more dominant, and so there has been competition about trying to win the elections, and even here, so when they first set up this system, they have this structure that there can only be, at any one time, only 3 parties competing in an election. And that was to force the clans to work together. So try to work with the clan structure. But but as we saw in various ways, this isn't really successful. But yeah, so there isn't, it's not like clans are literally fighting except for in the election. So this is another one of these ways in which this modern innovation of democracy is actually producing this kind of clan identification.
I was just wondering, as you were obviously speaking to people and doing interviews and using archives, how important is knowing the local language or languages and understanding those traditional actors or community actors? And how did you approach that?
No, I don't speak Somali. I thought, if this becomes a book, I will have to learn Somali, but I don't. Everybody there speaks, the elite there speak English. This was a project with elites, and Somaliland was colonized by the British, so that was one reason that I could study it. The one exception was the Sultan, who I showed you, and so I had a translator there. But yeah, no, I have often thought that depending on where this goes, I might end up having to learn Somali, but I don't yet.
Thank you. One question about where this goes, and one question about the case. In case of the case leading up to what Stefan said, it seems that kind of this is a case in which there was a resolution of political violence and then kind of state building happened. So it's very different from, say, Afghanistan, where there was never a resolution to political violence to the same extent that you're always at the threat of the Taliban. So there's an option to go to the Taliban, whereas if you have kind of more or less of a peaceful situation, you don't have perhaps that same potential. So is Afghanistan a good comparison here, or is Kosovo a better comparison? Yeah, you have a relationship between state building post-conflict, you have clan resolutions, is perhaps the southeastern part of post-Soviet Russia, so Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, good examples, because you have similar questions of customary law and state building and governance building. So is Afghanistan really the case that is similar, that is interesting? That's one question. The other question, how deep does the state building go? Is there land reform? Are there conflicts, kind of serious conflicts in terms of resource generations between the clans within the clans and the state? Is there a way in which what you've shown here challenges the authority of the clans, not just in kind of a political realm, but in the way they generate their income? Thank you.
Yeah. Great questions. So in terms of similarity to Afghanistan, so there is there is the independence from Somalia. Then the clans themselves in Somaliland, the sub-clans themselves in Somaliland, fall into a civil war. So the state building is kind of happening at the same time that the civil war is being resolved, which is why I thought there were some similarities to Afghanistan. That said, there are also a lot of differences to Afghanistan. I'm not trying to say that this is like it's not the kind of comparison in which you try to hold everything constant except for the one thing, right? It's the kind of comparison where I'm trying to say that even in cases that may not be exactly alike, non-state groups still matter. And what you do with non-state groups still matters. Although I'll have to think about the Uzbekistan, etc. That's an interesting idea, just to kind of see how far this travels and what exactly the scope conditions are. In terms of land reform and resource generation, so they don't have land. It's a pastoralist society. So they graze their camels. They move from place to place. Traditionally, they're nomadic. They move from place to place. They don't even respect, the national borders. Even today, they kind of go into Kenya and like that. So is the state the German word is what popped into my mind. Ergreifen. Is it grabbing clan resources? Yes, it is. So there were two dominant clans in the 1990s. This was the cause of the civil war. So one of the clans had control of the airport, and the other had control of the port in Berbera, which is very important because it's on the Horn of Africa. So the process of formal state building was getting both of these clans to give up those resources to the state. And this is a long and complicated process, which is also kind of tied into how the president subordinated the Gurti, which is I kind of skipped over because it's not really part of my story. But yes, a state is being built. It does have a tax revenue base. It did, in fact, convince the clans to give up significant resources to the state. That said, it's just a very, very poor country, so there's not a lot of resources to have given up. Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much, Monica, for this talk and opening perspectives which are a bit maybe also seem a bit worrying to those scholars who have grown up in a certain tradition of state and statehood. Coming back to one of your main conclusions, incorporating non-state actors into the state can undermine them. This is cautiously formulated because you showed that the state did undermine them and even wanted to undermine them. So my question is, doesn't a state always want to undermine these traditional affiliations so as to strengthen itself, so as to become something what Max Weber named a real state which has to undermine, has to abolish intermediate powers to be and to become a real territorial and potent state, but with a lot of potential. So, do we have to think in different way about states, different from just to name the Western sociological and legal tradition of state, to understand whether there can really be a hybrid system? Do we need another concept of state to see and to really realize what you call a hybrid state, which is the condition of making Somaliland a peaceful and stable regime?
Yeah, so it's cautiously formulated because after having done this research, I realized that to really do this research, I would need a completely different research design, which is I would examine instances of incorporation. So, I went into this not actually knowing what I was going to find. So I did this sort of, 3 different kinds of hybrid structure based on, prior scholarship, etc. But what I ended up concluding is that it's really co-optation, this incorporating the actor into the state, that is really where the most action is. So I really only have one case here, which shows that it can happen. And I think that's important to show, that in itself. But really what I think the research agenda is now is to examine lots of cases of incorporation and to see whether that happened. My fear, and the reason I phrase it cautiously, is that I worry that incorporating these non-state actors could it actually undermine the state? So you had this sort of complicated, perhaps contingent process in Somaliland. I'm not sure if it's really generalizable. So what I would say is that I'm pretty sure that we have to look at non-state actors and what's going on there. And I think I can show that it's possible to have this paradox, right? I don't think I can quite conclude yet that it's inevitably going to happen. And the factors of why it happens, I think that's kind of an open research field.
Yes, Monica, thank you very much for this great talk. I have a question coming back to one of your remarks when we were talking about Afghanistan. And you mentioned that Donald Rumsfeld thought about reconstructing Afghanistan like a Chicago-like political machine or so. I don't want to talk about Afghanistan, but when you look at this slide, one question comes into my mind, and that is, at some point, those elites must have a kind of an idea of what is a state. And as you said, Somalia and Somaliland has a colonial British heritage. And my question would be, do these kind of pictures of what a state is, these cultural traditions coming maybe from Europe or from other parts of the world, do they matter a lot in order to implement this kind of program you suggested in order to incorporate these traditional groups? Are state ideas very important for your project?
Is the idea of the state important for my project? So of course, there are coming from from the world in general, right? So Somaliland knows what it has to do. It has to have a flag. It has to have a currency. So all these kinds of world society kinds of arguments about this is how you become a state. But that said, anthropologists who study corruption around the world and state building around the world tell us that even if you go to parts of Africa that have never actually experienced a functioning state, there is this sense of what a state should be and what a state should do, and that the leader should not be taking people's resources for his family. So there is this this sort of sense of what functioning authority means. The Somaliland, it's very important for them to be recognized as a state, and for that reason, the idea of a state is important. They know that they have to check off these boxes. What frustrates them is that they have checked off all these boxes and still they're not being recognized, whereas Somalia has not checked off any of the boxes, and it's the one that is seen as sovereign. Somalia, by the way, was colonized by the Italians. It was kind of colonized in a direct rule form, which is why they destroyed the clan elders. They wanted a sort of direct relationship with the state. Also, I should just mention that Somaliland, just a couple of weeks ago, Ethiopia has agreed. It's not clear if this is actually going to happen, but the agreement is that Ethiopia is going to recognize Somaliland in return for access to the sea through Somaliland. If it happens, it would be the first actual country to recognize Somaliland. Taiwan recognizes Somaliland, but of course Taiwan is itself not recognized. So, yeah. And there's also a U.S. delegation recently visited Hargeisa, so I'm told, and everyone is waiting to see if that's going to produce anything.
Thanks a lot for this very fascinating and very complex talk. So my first question is a question of comprehension, which maybe I just missed, and I think it links to what you were just talking about. But I didn't quite understand when you talk about this kind of this girthy losing legitimacy, and this, I think, led you to this paradox of inclusion. You have this affinity for problem solving. So is this part of, I don't want to say the solution, but of why you're saying this is working so well? This loss of legitimacy? That will be my first question. And the second one is merely out of curiosity. The other thing you talked about, these different legal orders existing alongside each other, state and customary law and religious law. And it sounded like it's a matter of choice. You can choose which kind of jurisdiction you want to go to. Is this really so? Or is there a kind of hierarchy that imposes itself there too?
So you can choose with some things. So like with a case of rape, not the woman, but the family decides whether to go to the official, the formal system or the customary system. With some things you can't. So like for some religious things, Sharia law, trumps everything else. Yeah, and this is definitely part of my problem-solving efforts, right? So the big question is, what do you do about poverty? And there is this interesting case in Somaliland. So even if you're not convinced by the argument that I'm making, I still think there's something very interesting to examine what's going on in Somaliland, because it has actually managed to build a state. And I didn't bring some of the economic data, but they kind of look like what the education data and the other data are. Somaliland is doing a little bit better than Somalia is. So.
Prozeduren, die nicht wirklich routinisiert und eingespielt sind, lautet, dass die Preisträgerin Blumen bekommt, aber nicht nur Blumen, sondern auch einen Gravur mit einer Gravur behübschten, Sie können es besser ausdrücken als ich, in dem eingraviert ist Monika Prasad, Landshut-Preisträgerin 2023. Nochmals herzlichen Glückwunsch.
Thank you. Honestly, this is genuinely an honor to come here and to be brought here and to have to have met you. And thank you so much for the wonderful lunch that we had and the wonderful conversations we had. And thank you for your attention here as well.
Great. Thank you.